Hey guys, tonight we set out on a weary road, not as knights in armor or royalty in shining carriages, but as the kind of soul history tends to forget. The poor peasant, dusty boots, aching legs, and only the faint hope of finding a half-dry spot to collapse for the night. You imagine the fading orange glow of the sunset dipping behind low hills, your cloak, or what's left of it, stiff with old rain and the smell of smoke from someone else's fire clinging to it. The cart ruts on the track feel endless, and your stomach, empty since midday, keeps reminding you that supper might not come with a bed. Truth be told, if you were really traveling the medieval countryside with little more than a bundle and a prayer, you probably wouldn't survive this week, let alone the year. That's your little reality check for tonight. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love for you to drop your location and the local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see who's out there drifting off together, no matter how far apart we really are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk along, shoulders slumped under the thin weight of your bag, thinking about where you might land when the sky fully darkens. In your mind, you picture the most luxurious option, a dry barn with fresh straw. That would be heaven tonight, but heaven is rare. More often, peasants on the road made do with the ground itself, a cloak for a blanket, and maybe a nearby hedge to cut the wind. The path isn't smooth. It's a rutted trail where water pools in muddy grooves. Your shoes soak through, squishing with every step. This is no paved Roman highway. Those days are long past, and the upkeep never lasted. By now, medieval roads are patchworks of mud, stones, and wishful thinking. Historians still argue whether the average medieval traveler was more slowed down by bad road maintenance or by tolls that forced them to zigzag across the countryside just to save a few pennies. Either way, your night's rest is affected. A washed-out bridge or a swollen stream might leave you stranded short of the next village, and that means bedding down in the open. When you do find straw, don't expect golden bales tied neatly like in farm-themed calendars. No, it's loose, scratchy, and half-damp from the animals that warmed it before you. Still, it smells faintly of hay and soil, not the worst thing to curl up in. One quirky tidbit. There are records of innkeepers selling the right to sleep in a truss of straw on the floor. You didn't rent a bed, you rented straw. Sometimes you even had to share your little patch with strangers, shoulder to shoulder, like sardines who hadn't learned about personal space yet. The night creeps in quickly when there are no street lamps, only a thin silvering of moonlight to guide you. You hear distant dogs barking, the splash of frogs in a ditch, and the occasional flap of a bird startled from a hedge. Everything smells sharper in the night. Damp earth, wood smoke curling from faraway chimneys, even the faint sweetness of rotting apples in a cart left roadside. You wrap your cloak tighter, pretending it's thicker than it really is. If you stumble into a cottage on your way, you might beg a spot by the hearth. Hospitality was complicated. Some households offered food and space out of Christian duty, but others locked their doors against strangers, fearful of thieves, disease, or just the hassle of feeding one more mouth. And who could blame them? You too would hesitate before letting in some road-worn stranger who smelled like mud, sweat, and hopeless optimism. Imagine you do get lucky and a kindly soul lets you in. The floor by the fire becomes your mattress. The fire's smoke clings to the rafters, darkening them with centuries of soot. It stings your eyes, but the warmth makes you forgive it. You might dream to the soft sound of the fire crackling, or to the rattle of someone else's snores in the corner. It's not luxurious, but it beats shivering outside. And yet, not every night ends with kindness. Many peasants ended up beneath hedgerows, in ruined buildings, or tucked against the side of a hayrick. The smell of animals thick in the air. You might use your own bundle of belongings as a pillow, hard and lumpy, but at least familiar. One light joke for your trouble? At least fleas don't charge rent. They come included, free of cost. and sometimes travelers carried small mats or blankets rolled tight across their shoulders. Picture yourself unrolling yours on a patch of dirt that at least looks dry. A stone might jab your ribs, but the cloak pulled over your head muffles the sound of the night. Somewhere out there, an owl hoots, and your brain helpfully whispers that it could also be a ghost, because why not? Quirky fact: some medieval people actually believed owls were witches in bird form, watching you from the branches. Comforting, isn't it? The weariness of the day pushes against your eyelids. You're not alone in this. Poor peasants across Europe followed similar patterns, trudging mile after mile, always weighing the risk of strangers against the certainty of cold ground. You imagine the journey stretching ahead. More villages, more dirt tracks, more hedges for pillows. It was never glamorous, but in its own way it shaped the rhythm of life and the slow heartbeat of travel in a world without speed or convenience. The stars above are clear, sharp, endless. You look up once more before letting sleep drag you down. And here, on this simple road with nothing more than straw, soil, and luck, you join the millions of forgotten travelers whose nights looked exactly like this. Your eyes open to the chill of early light, the kind that makes everything look gray before it turns golden. You push yourself up from the patch of dirt and straw that passed for a bed last night, brushing twigs from your cloak. The road stretches ahead, uneven and unforgiving. Travel for someone of your means is never smooth. It's a matter of slogging through whatever path presents itself, and today, the path means rickety bridges, muddy ruts, and choices you don't want to make about where you'll stop once the sun dips again. The roads in medieval Europe were a lottery. Some stretches still followed the bones of old Roman roads, straight, elevated, and surprisingly durable centuries later. Others were nothing more than trampled paths that twisted with the land, easily washed out by spring rains. And while you might hope for a steady pace, you often find yourself slowing to crawl behind carts loaded with firewood or stone, creaking painfully along. Historians still argue whether medieval governments invested enough in maintaining public routes, or if it was left almost entirely to local communities who patched things when they could. Either way, you, the peasant traveler, feel every rut in your knees and every wobbling plank in your feet. Bridges are an event. You approach one that looks more like a dare than a structure. It's made of timber, damp with mist, the beams slightly warped. A crooked railing offers no comfort. You picture the toll keeper on the far side, eyeing you like you're about to make his day interesting. Some bridges demanded a toll even for foot traffic. A few pennies if you had them, or maybe a barter, your apple for his permission. One quirky tidbit: there were bridges in medieval Europe with small chapels built right on them. The idea was that you could pause, cross yourself, and pray you made it to the other side without falling in. Not a bad idea, considering the timbers sway with every step you take. Of course, not every river is blessed with a bridge. Many are crossed with ferries, flat-bottomed boats guided by ropes or poles. They don't run after dark, though. If you reach a river too late, you're out of luck. And what does that mean? It means bedding down on the bank, shivering as damp air rolls off the water. Maybe you find a hollow beneath a tree root. Maybe you curse your luck and joke that at least the frogs are good company. Joke number one of the day: you've probably never shared bedtime with so many amphibians in your life. Sometimes the road simply disappears into a boggy patch. Your shoes sink, sucking noises follow, and you fight to keep your bundle dry. Imagine trudging ankle deep, then having to stop early because your legs feel like lead. That's where the roadside becomes your lodging. A patch of semi-dry ground if you can find it, or even an abandoned cart turned sideways to block the wind. Not glamorous, but effective. Villages dot the way, but they're not evenly spaced. Some routes leave you with long, empty stretches. The distance between potential shelter can mean hours of extra walking, which adds up when daylight itself is a scarce resource. You don't want to be caught far from people after dark, not because of wolves, though yes, they were around in parts of Europe, but because the night belonged to thieves and worse. Travelers often joined together in loose groups just for this reason. Safety in numbers, even if your number is 3 tired peasants with nothing but walking sticks. The debate rages among scholars. Did medieval authorities encourage overnight stops along routes through official stations, or were those more a luxury of wealthy merchants and royal messengers? For the poor, the evidence points more to improvisation. Wherever you could collapse, you did. That could be beneath a bridge in the corner of a sheepfold or under a hedgerow again. You picture yourself arriving at a crossroads, the kind where a weather-beaten signpost leans sideways, one arrow pointing vaguely toward a town, another to who knows where. Crossroads themselves were eerie. Folklore swirled around them, spirits haunting the meeting of paths, lost souls wandering in circles. And here's a quirky fringe detail. Some places buried criminals at crossroads, partly as a warning and partly to confuse their spirits so they wouldn't trouble the living. Now imagine lying down to sleep under that same signpost. Sweet dreams, right? Joke number 2. Nothing says restful night like bedding down on top of someone who was executed last week. By evening, the road's condition dictates your decision. If the next village is too far, you resign yourself to a makeshift camp. The soundscape is familiar now. Crickets chirping, owls hooting, the wind tugging at your hair. You spread out what little you have, and maybe, just maybe, you find the remains of a broken cart by the roadside. You crawl inside, wedged against the wheel, and pretend the creaking wood is a protective roof. It smells of old hay and wet leather, but to you, it's a palace. Bridges, roads, ruts, and rivers, they all shape where you'll rest your head. You don't control the rhythm of your nights. The land and the road do. Still, you push on because the only choice is forward. And when your eyes finally close, sore from the day's glare and the smoke of your little fire, you wonder what tomorrow's route will demand and where it will let you lay down. The day drifts onward, and you find your feet carrying you into the smell of roasted barley and sour ale, the scent that always betrays the presence of a tavern or alehouse before you even see it. For a poor peasant on the road, the sight of a painted signboard swinging on creaky hinges is both relief and dilemma. You crave warmth, noise, and maybe even a morsel of food. But coin? That's another story. Taverns are the middle ground between the roadside hedge and a monastery bed. They promise shelter, but only if your purse has the weight to prove it. You duck through the low door frame into a common room, thick with smoke. A fire burns at one end, crackling merrily, and the rafters are already blackened with soot. The air is alive with voices, laughter, arguments, and the heavy slosh of ale being poured into wooden mugs. The scent of stew, onions, and animal fat wraps around you, and for a moment you almost forget the ache in your legs. This is no private inn for noblemen. This is the alehouse where farmers, peddlers, and wandering strangers mingle in noisy chaos. But here's the catch. You can't just waltz in and claim a bed. For the poor, the bed is usually the floor of the common room, a bench if you're lucky. And that's not even guaranteed. You have to negotiate. Sometimes you pay in coin, sometimes in barter. One quirky fact: there are surviving references to peasants literally paying for the privilege of lying by the fire. That meant staking out the warmest corner of the room for the night, even if you had to curl up like a cat. And here comes joke number 1. In a tavern, the fleas are well fed, but at least they're drunk from all the spilled ale, so maybe they bite slower. The atmosphere is lively, but sleep doesn't come easily. There's always someone telling a story too loud, someone clattering a mug against the table, and someone vomiting conveniently near where your head rests. You close your eyes and listen to the shuffle of dice on the table. Gambling is as common as drinking here, though it often ends with an argument. Historians still argue whether taverns were primarily social hubs for the poor, or tools of lords and towns to control peasants with cheap drink and distractions. Either way, you, the weary traveler, don't care. You're too busy trying to keep your feet from being stepped on by a latecomer staggering to the fire. Alehouses varied wildly. In some, the keeper brewed beer so weak it was practically flavored water. In others, the drink was strong enough to knock you sideways. Food might mean a thin pottage, a grain stew flavored with onions, and maybe, if you're truly blessed, a bit of meat. Sometimes tavern keepers allowed guests to bring their own bread or dried fish to eat at the table, charging only for the ale. Imagine pulling out your humble loaf while the table next to you tears into a roasted chicken. The scent mocks you, but your bread fills your stomach enough to keep you moving tomorrow. Here's a quirky tidbit. Certain towns required alehouse keepers to maintain honest beds for travelers. In practice, that could mean a thin pallet in a loft stuffed with straw and shared with 3 strangers. The medieval version of a hostel bunk, except without clean sheets, earplugs, or polite roommates. Joke number 2. If you thought snoring roommates were bad today, try 3 guys in a row after they've all downed 4 pints of medieval ale. Of course, taverns weren't just places for rest. They were hotbeds of gossip and local news. You might overhear talk of markets, marriages, or taxes while you lie on the floor pretending to sleep. Someone might even warn you about the road ahead, a washed-out bridge, a village closed off due to plague, or rumors of bandits lurking by the next forest. These whispers mattered because, unlike the wealthy who had letters and couriers, you relied on the drunken chatter of strangers to plan your journey. And yet, taverns were not universally safe. Fights broke out, purses disappeared. In some towns, authorities even tried to restrict how late people could stay in alehouses because too many ended in brawls. For a weary peasant, the tavern could be both haven and hazard. If you can't pay, or if the room is already bursting with bodies, you might find yourself relegated to the stables. There, you curl against the smell of hay and manure, your lullaby the shifting hooves of horses and the steady munch of cattle chewing cud. Oddly enough, many travelers preferred it. At least animals didn't start bar fights. And the hay was warmer than a drafty bench inside. Historians still debate how much of this nightly tavern life shaped medieval culture at large. Was the alehouse simply a convenience for travelers, or was it the beating heart of peasant community life? Standing here, breathing in the stew and smoke, you'd probably argue for the second. Everyone eventually ends up here. Farmer, pilgrim, mason, or wandering laborer. The tavern is where paths cross and stories mingle. And tonight, your story is just another one folded into the smoky rafters of this common room. You close your eyes, tuck your bag beneath your head, and pretend the laughter and shouting are a kind of lullaby. Joke number 3. You'll either dream sweetly tonight or wake up with someone else's foot in your face. Either way, you won't be sleeping under a hedge, and that's a small victory. By the time you leave the tavern's smoky rafters behind, your body feels like it has been both revived and punished. Revived by warmth, punished by noise and the not-so-gentle snores of drunk strangers. The road pulls you forward again, and soon the spire of a church rises on the horizon. For a poor traveler, that sight is like a faint lantern in the distance, promising not just prayers, but possibly a bed, or at least a roof. Churches, monasteries, and hospitals run by religious orders often extended hospitality to the weary. But don't get too excited. The rules were strict, the space is limited, and charity always had conditions. Imagine approaching the gates of a pilgrim hostel, a low squat building near a shrine or church. The air smells of incense drifting faintly from the chapel, mixing with the sharper scent of smoke from the kitchens. You clutch your bundle tighter as you shuffle toward the door, hoping you're not too late to claim a spot inside. Pilgrim hostels were built with travelers in mind, but not just any traveler. If you were walking with the badge of a pilgrim pinned to your cloak, a little lead shell for Santiago, a cross for Jerusalem, or a scallop for Rome, your chances of welcome rose. These badges were the medieval passport, the physical proof that you weren't just wandering aimlessly, but had a holy destination. Without one, your story of just passing through might not carry much weight. Historians still argue whether pilgrim hostels were truly open to the poor, or whether they quietly favored wealthier visitors who could make donations. Officially, they were meant to serve all. In practice, rules varied. Some allowed only 1 or 2 nights of stay before pushing you back onto the road. Others were stricter. Pilgrims were admitted only at certain times of day, often after prayers. If you arrived late, the heavy wooden door stayed closed and you curled up against the church wall outside. Inside, when you were admitted, life was simple. Beds were narrow planks or pallets stuffed with straw, lined in rows. Privacy was not the point. You were shoulder to shoulder with strangers, some coughing, some praying aloud, some already snoring. A friar or sister walked among you, checking for troublemakers. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the faint tang of candle wax. Still, compared to the ditch by the road, it was paradise. Here's a quirky detail. Some hostels also doubled as hospitals. Travelers too weak to continue were laid on separate pallets, tended by brothers or sisters with herbal remedies, honeyed drinks, or poultices of herbs. You, lying nearby, tried to sleep while someone moaned through the night. Comforting, perhaps not, but it meant you might wake up with a bit of broth in your bowl, something you hadn't tasted for weeks. And yes, let's not forget the rules. You prayed before eating, you ate whatever was served, and you followed the house's rhythm. That might mean being woken for a midnight psalm or joining morning mass before you were allowed to move on. Joke number 1 tonight. Nothing says sweet dreams like a bell yanking you out of slumber to chant before dawn. Charity was never without limits. Many of these institutions were overwhelmed, especially along major pilgrimage routes. Some were well endowed by nobles and kings with stone dormitories and dedicated kitchens. Others were little more than wooden halls, with a few pallets run by villagers scraping resources together. It was a gamble every time you approached one. Would you find bread and shelter, or just a nod toward the fields outside where you might camp under the stars again? And speaking of bread, meals here were plain but steady. Dark loaves, onion broth, maybe a scrap of fish on a festival day. The bread was coarse, flecked with bits of husk, but it filled the stomach. If you were lucky, a pot of ale was passed around. You took what was offered and kept your eyes low, mindful that gratitude was expected. Scholars debate just how widespread these hostels were across Europe. In Spain and Italy, where pilgrim routes were heavily trafficked, they sprang up like beads along a string. In rural England or Germany, the options thinned, and churches themselves became the fallback. Stone porches where you could huddle against the wall, shielded from wind. Sometimes local custom allowed you to sleep inside the church itself, on the cold flagstones near the door. Not exactly a feather mattress, but the saints carved in stained glass looked down as silent guardians. Quirky tidbit number 2. In some places, records suggest that travelers slept in the bell tower, or even under the altar canopy, depending on local practice. Imagine trying to sleep while the rope above you creaks and the bell threatens to clang at dawn. That would wake you faster than any rooster. The presence of hostels shaped your journey, giving you stepping stones of relative safety. You might plan your day's march around the next one, even if it meant pushing your body further than you'd like. The thought of a roof, however modest, was strong motivation, and if denied, you swallowed the rejection and found your way to a hedge, a barn, or the ground again. Joke number 2. Nothing humbles you faster than being told by a monk that your only bed tonight is the grace of God, which sounds poetic until you realize it means sleeping outdoors. For all the discomfort, these hostels and church-run shelters stitched a net of fragile security across the map. They were imperfect, overcrowded, sometimes unfair, but for the poor peasant who had nowhere else to go, they were often the only hope. And so night after night you move between straw benches and these narrow planks of charity, letting your body rest just enough to walk again tomorrow. And as you close your eyes beneath a wooden roof offered by strangers in robes, you feel the strange mixture of gratitude and dependence that defines so much of poor travel in this age. A The bell might wake you. The food might be thin. And the bed might crawl with lice, but for tonight at least you're inside. Joke number 3. Try to ignore the fact that the holy relic you're sleeping beside might actually be the thigh bone of a cow. Authenticity wasn't always guaranteed. The path winds farther, and this time your feet draw you toward the shadow of high walls and the rhythmic toll of bells. A monastery looms ahead, stone rising gray against the landscape, its fields neatly hedged, its orchards carefully tended. Unlike the smoky tavern or the makeshift pilgrim hostel, monasteries carry an air of order, silence, and routine. For a weary traveler, they hold out both promise and warning. Yes, you might find a meal and a roof, but you will also find rules. More rules than you ever wanted at the end of a long road. You shuffle toward the guest house, a separate wing or small building often built for outsiders. Hospitality here is not optional. It's a spiritual duty. Monks take in travelers not because it's profitable, but because Scripture commands it. Still, don't imagine you'll be coddled. Monks live with discipline, and you, the wandering peasant, are expected to follow along. Joke number 1. If you thought your mom waking you early was strict, wait until you meet a monk with a bell and a sense of eternal duty. Inside, the air smells of beeswax and stone dust. A brother greets you without chatter, only a nod, and directs you to a wooden pallet in the guest chamber. The space is bare, no fire blazing merrily, no chatter of alehouse drinkers, just silence, broken by the occasional cough of another traveler already wrapped in his cloak. Privacy? Forget it. You're lined up like cordwood, each pallet stuffed with straw, sometimes shared if the house is crowded. Historians still argue whether monasteries were truly generous to the poorest peasants or reserved their hospitality for wealthier pilgrims and messengers of importance. The official rules, like the famous rule of Saint Benedict, commanded monks to receive guests as though they were Christ himself. In practice, however, the warmth of that welcome could cool quickly if you looked more like a vagrant than a pilgrim. Food was plain but nourishing. Imagine being led to the refectory, where monks eat in total silence, while a brother reads scripture aloud from a lectern. You, the guest, receive the same: bread, beans, maybe a bit of cheese. Meat was rare in many orders, though certain monasteries bent the rules with creative loopholes. Quirky tidbit: some monasteries declared that waterfowl counted as fish, and thus could be eaten even on fast days. So if you're very lucky, your peasant stomach might end up with a bite of goose disguised as holy fish. After supper, silence thickens. The monks retire to prayer and you to your pallet. The bells ring at odd hours, slicing through sleep. Monastic life is organized around constant prayer, and you're swept along in the rhythm. If you happen to sleep through the bell, no one drags you up, but good luck finding rest when half the house is rustling, to shuffle off to chant psalms in the dark chapel. Joke number 2. Your lullaby tonight is 40 monks chanting in Latin, which, let's be honest, is slightly more soothing than a tavern fight, but not exactly what you'd put on your Spotify playlist. There were stories, whispered and half-believed, about secret guest quarters hidden deeper in the monastery. Some claim that lords or high officials were tucked away in private chambers, served wine and better meals, while common folk like you were stacked in the guest hall. Whether true or not, the suspicion lingered, and even now historians debate just how equal monastic hospitality really was. The guest house was not only for travelers, but also for the sick and the poor from nearby villages. You might find yourself lying next to a feverish child, or a coughing farmer too weak to make it home. The air carried not only the scent of straw, but also the sharp tang of illness. And while monks offered herbal remedies, honey, and prayers, you couldn't help but wonder if you might leave with more problems than you arrived with. Yet the stability of a monastery was unmatched. The stone walls, the orderly gardens, the disciplined silence, it all felt different from the chaos of taverns or the cold of open fields. For one night, you were part of something larger, something steady. You might wake to the sight of monks moving quietly through cloisters, their sandals whispering on the stone, their hoods shadowing their faces. You are a guest, a speck in the ongoing rhythm of their timeless cycle. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some monasteries were famous for their brewing, and a guest might be offered ale strong enough to wipe the road dust from your soul. Just 1 cup, of course. This wasn't the tavern, but it meant your night came with a warmer stomach than most. By morning, you're nudged awake by the toll of another bell. Guests are expected to leave promptly. Hospitality has its limits. You rise, stretch stiff limbs, and shoulder your bundle again, grateful for bread in your belly and a roof that shielded you from the night air. But you also know you've been just another footnote in the endless stream of wanderers moving through the monastery guest hall. And before you step through the gates, you can't help but smile at the irony. Joke number 3. You've just slept in the house of God, but you're leaving with the same fleas you arrived with. Some blessings are apparently eternal. Leaving the stone calm of the monastery behind, your feet drag you toward another kind of power, the manor. Out here, lords rule not just fields and crops, but people, and their homes are both centers of authority and potential sources of shelter. For a wandering peasant like you, the great house on the hill is less a beacon of charity and more a roll of the dice. The manor might offer warmth and bread, but it might also offer suspicion, demands, or outright rejection. You approach the gatehouse where a guard leans on a pike and watches you with eyes that say, "Why are you here?" Hospitality at manors was technically an obligation. Lords were expected to provide food and lodging for travelers, especially if you were on royal business or pilgrimage. But you're just a poor soul with muddy boots. The rules bend quickly depending on who asks. Inside the manor yard, smells hit you, straw mixed with horse dung, the sweet smoke of roasting meat, which you almost certainly won't taste, and the sharp tang of tanned leather. Dogs bark as you shuffle closer, clutching your bundle like a talisman. If fortune smiles, the steward allows you into a side hall or a barn, a bit of straw, maybe a blanket if they're feeling generous, but don't imagine you'll be stretched out in the Lord's own bedchamber. Joke number 1, the Lord's dogs are treated better than you, but at least they'll share their fleas without complaint. Historians still argue whether peasants often sought hospitality at manors or avoided them unless desperate. Records show lords did feed passing travelers, but also that they charged fees or expected labor in return. Imagine being told, after trudging for hours, that your bed comes with a morning chore, hauling water, chopping wood, or mucking out stables. Comfort comes with strings, and in a feudal world, every string ties back to duty. Meals at a manor varied wildly. The lord's household might feast on venison and wine, but the scraps handed to travelers were usually coarse bread, thin ale, and maybe a ladle of stew. Still, even scraps tasted heavenly compared to gnawing on a crust alone by the roadside. You sit on a bench with servants and workers, the fire throwing shadows across the hall. Above, the rafters ring with the sounds of laughter from the high table. You're invisible, but you're warm. And for one night, that's enough. Quirky tidbit. Some lords kept official almonries, small buildings or rooms dedicated to distributing alms, bread, ale, or a place to rest. These were meant to fulfill their religious duty of charity. Yet stories abound of travelers being turned away if the supply had already run out, left to sleep in ditches outside the manor gates. One chronicler even mentions peasants bedding down in pigsties near noble estates, claiming at least the pigs gave off warmth, which, let's be honest, is probably the medieval equivalent of cuddling a space heater. But manors weren't just about food and straw, they were also about power. Your very presence could be seen as suspicious. Was a wandering peasant just a pilgrim? Or a thief casing the Lord's barns? Stewards sometimes demanded proof of purpose, a letter, or a badge before allowing you past the gate. Failed to provide it, and you risked more than rejection. You could be fined. whipped, or shoved back onto the road with curses following you. And then there's billeting, which flips the arrangement entirely. Sometimes, instead of you begging for shelter, soldiers or messengers showed up at a manor demanding beds. The peasants of the estate were then forced to host them. Cramped quarters, no choice. That's the same energy that rippled down to you, the traveling poor. Hospitality was always a negotiation of power. Who owed whom, and who could demand what. Joke number 2. If you ever thought Airbnb reviews were harsh, imagine medieval peasants swapping notes. Room was drafty, dogs bit me, steward demanded 3 hours of unpaid labor. 2 stars. Still, manners shaped the rhythm of travel. They were fixed points of wealth in a sea of poverty, places where you might scrape by on leftovers and obligations. A lord's generosity, or lack of it, could define your memory of an entire journey. Some were famed for kindness, giving freely to all who asked. Others were notorious for cruelty, slamming gates in the faces of the poor. The stories traveled farther than you did, whispered from tavern bench to monastery pallet. At dawn, you rise stiff from your straw pallet in the manor barn. The steward eyes you, checking that you leave nothing behind but flattened hay. You sling your bundle over your shoulder, stomach fuller than usual, and step back onto the muddy road. For a fleeting moment, you wonder what it would be like to live in the manor itself, where walls keep out the cold and feasts banish hunger. But the thought fades quickly. You belong to the road, the hedge, and the endless gamble of tomorrow's lodging. Joke number 3. At least you didn't end up sharing the pigsty tonight. Small victories, even when they smell like manure. The road bends, and this time it doesn't lead you toward a church spire or a lord's hall, but down to the water's edge. Rivers cut through the land like silver ribbons, and they have to be crossed somehow. Where there's a bridge or a ferry, there's almost always a toll house nearby. And toll houses, like taverns, became accidental inns for poor travelers. You don't plan on them, but when dusk falls and your legs give out, you might find yourself curled against the very walls that guard the crossing. Imagine approaching a wooden bridge, its planks warped by rain, the posts carved with faint crosses or saints to bless the structure. The tollkeeper leans out of his hut, demanding a penny for the privilege of not drowning. You fumble with your purse, hoping you've got enough, or maybe you barter with food, a crust of bread traded for safe passage. Historians still argue whether tolls were meant as road upkeep or just as local lords' pocket money. Either way, you pay or you walk miles upstream hunting for a ford, and if the sun's already sliding low, you might not risk it. You'll stay here, near the toll house, with nothing more glamorous than the bridge's shadow for a roof. The toll house itself is a squat structure, stone or timber, its single room filled with the smell of ink, ale, and damp clothes. Travelers gather here waiting for ferries or for dawn to make the bridge less terrifying. If you're lucky, the tollkeeper lets you sleep by the hearth. If not, you wedge yourself against the outside wall using the building to block the wind. Joke number 1, congratulations. You've just invented the first roadside motel, complete with grumpy clerk and no complimentary breakfast. Ferries are another kind of ordeal. By day, they're bustling, ferrying carts, animals, and pilgrims across the current. By night, they stop. If you arrive too late, you're stuck on the bank, watching the boat tethered uselessly to the shore. Your room becomes the muddy slope beside the water, the lapping waves slapping against your dreams. The river breathes dampness into your bones, and every frog croak sounds like mockery. Still, it beats swimming with your bundle held over your head. Quirky tidbit. Some ferrymen were notorious for doubling as innkeepers, charging travelers not only to cross, but also for beds in their sheds or barns. Beds here meant straw scattered on the ground or a loft above the animals, but the ferryman knew he had you trapped. Unless you fancied wandering upstream in the dark, you paid his price and thanked him for the privilege. Sometimes bridges themselves became destinations. A few were lined with chapels, shrines, or even shops, turning the crossing into a miniature market. Imagine bedding down under one of these arches, the river roaring beneath, the stone cold against your back. Not exactly cozy, but at least solid. Historians still debate whether these multi-use bridges served mainly pilgrims, or whether they were just opportunistic real estate. Spirituality meeting capitalism long before the modern era. Night at a bridge crossing carries its own soundtrack. Horses clopping across planks, the creak of wood under wheels, the murmur of voices negotiating tolls in the dark. You lie there, cloak wrapped tight, half asleep, half alert, wondering whether the toll keeper will chase you off. Sometimes they did. Other times they ignored you, muttering about beggars while secretly glad your presence deterred thieves. Joke number 2. Who needs a lock on your door when you've got a suspicious toll keeper glaring at every stranger who comes within 10 feet? If you're really unlucky, you arrive at flood season. The bridge might be washed out, the ferry useless. You and a cluster of other travelers huddle on the bank, trading rumors. How long until the waters fall? Days? Weeks? In such times, the toll house transforms into a crowded dormitory with bodies packed tighter than fish in a barrel. The smell is unforgettable. Wet wool, wet boots, wet everything. But at least the misery is shared, and misery, as you know by now, makes strange friendships. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some toll houses kept guest books, or at least lists of names, for travelers who passed through. These were partly for accounting and partly for surveillance. Imagine your weary scrawl ending up in some dusty ledger, proof that you once slept against a toll house wall centuries before anyone thought to invent TripAdvisor. As dawn breaks, the ferryman's boat bumps against the shore, and the bridge echoes with new traffic. You rise stiffly from your bed, brushing mud from your cloak, and shuffle back into the stream of movement. The crossing is just another point on the endless road, but for one night it shaped where you lay, what you heard, and how cold your bones felt. And as you glance back at the toll house shrinking in the distance, you can't help but laugh softly at the thought. Joke number 3. Medieval bridges weren't just for crossing rivers. They were also for crossing your fingers and praying you didn't fall through a missing plank in the middle of the night. The toll house fades behind you, and the road soon carries you toward a burst of noise and color that breaks the monotony of mud and hedgerows. It's a market fair, the medieval version of a pop-up city. For a few days or weeks, sleepy fields and town squares transform into a carnival of traders, jugglers, cooks, thieves, and buyers. For you, the weary traveler with little more than a cloak and aching feet, a fair means something even more valuable than bargains. It means a place, some place, any place to sleep. As you approach, the sounds grow louder. Hawkers shouting prices, fiddlers scraping out tunes, children squealing as they chase each other between carts. The air is rich with smells, roasting meat you can't afford, freshly baked bread you might, and the tang of livestock penned for sale. The fair is crowded, chaotic, alive, and when evening falls, all those people need somewhere to sleep. Inns burst at the seams, taverns overflow, and suddenly every stall, barn, and patch of ground becomes an impromptu dormitory. For the poor peasant, your bed tonight is whatever you can claim. Maybe it's a spot beneath a canvas awning, pressed against the rough planks of a merchant's stall. Maybe it's a corner of a barn, the straw already flattened by cows. Sometimes it's just the ground itself, hard and unforgiving, but at least surrounded by the murmuring crowd. Joke number 1, you've officially joined the medieval version of a music festival, minus the music, plus a lot more sheep. Historians still argue whether fairs were primarily commercial events or deeply social gatherings. What's certain is that they reshaped travel. People walked miles to attend, and the sudden need for lodging created a temporary housing crisis centuries before anyone coined that phrase. Wealthy merchants might pay for rooms in the best inns, but the poor? You sprawled where you could, sometimes cheek to cheek with strangers. Quirky tidbit, some fairs actually had regulations about where people could sleep. In a few towns, sleeping inside stalls was banned, partly to protect goods, partly to stop fires from careless candles. Of course, rules didn't stop desperate peasants. More than one merchant woke to find his stall double-booked. Him on one side, a snoring traveler on the other. As night deepens, the fair transforms. Fires burn in iron braziers, their smoke rising into the star-patched sky. Storytellers draw little crowds, and dice games continue long after the booths close. For you, lying on your cloak in a corner, the fair's music is your lullaby. Pipes wheezing, drums tapping, voices rising in laughter. It's loud, yes, but strangely comforting. Safety comes in numbers, and tonight you're surrounded by hundreds of souls doing the same thing you are, just trying to make it through until dawn. But safety is never guaranteed. Fairs attracted thieves as surely as they attracted merchants. Sleeping in the open meant keeping one hand on your bundle, even while you dreamed. Joke number 2. Congratulations, you've invented the world's least comfortable security system. Your body, draped awkwardly over your own bag. Sometimes the lucky ones found lodging in barns owned by local farmers, who quickly realized there was money to be made. For a small fee, they let peasants spread across haylofts, shoulder to shoulder. The smell of animals was thick, but the hay was soft, and laughter often drifted up as people whispered stories into the dark. You might even share a loaf with a stranger, trading tales of villages you've never seen. And then there were the true improvisers. Some travelers slept in wagons, stretching out on the hard planks beneath their own goods. Others fashioned makeshift tents from cloaks and poles. A few simply curled up by their fire pits, embers glowing faintly against the blackness. Historians still debate whether fairs provided enough official shelter, but the evidence suggests most poor folk relied on their own creativity. The fair itself became one giant sprawling campsite. Quirky tidbit number 2. Certain fairs were so enormous they had their own court of pie powders, a quick justice system for disputes among traders. Imagine being woken in the night not by snoring but by a judge in a tent, settling a case about stolen boots. Only at a fair could you fall asleep to the sound of medieval small claims court, and when the dawn finally creeps back, the fair stirs awake with the rustle of canvas and the smell of bread frying on griddles. You rise stiff from your corner, brushing straw and dust from your cloak, your stomach grumbling at scents you still can't afford. The fair continues vibrant and relentless, but you know your road pulls you onward. One more night of improvised rest, one more roof, or lack thereof, added to your story. Joke number 3. You might leave the fair with no money, no sleep, and a suspicious rash from that straw mattress. But hey, you gotta listen to a drunk juggler sing ballads at midnight. That's practically worth it. By the time you've left the noise of the fair behind, the road winds you into quieter company. Pilgrims. They shuffle along with staffs in hand, badges pinned to cloaks, and songs half sung under their breath. Pilgrimage was one of the most common reasons poor folk traveled far from home, and with it came a whole network of sleeping options. But don't picture endless charity and feather beds. No, for the penniless pilgrim, every night meant weighing a few coins against hunger, or begging for space on a floor. You walk with them, hearing stories of distant shrines, miracles, and sore feet. Pilgrims were supposed to be treated well by innkeepers and locals, but the truth was complicated. Paid lodgings were available, yes, but they ranged from decent straw mattresses to overpriced corners in crowded halls. Some places even charged extra if you wanted a blanket. Imagine that nickel and diming in the 14th century. Joke number 1. Apparently, Holy Journey didn't come with a holy discount. One mainstream fact, pilgrimage economies thrived on these travelers. Towns along popular routes like the Camino to Santiago or the road to Canterbury grew rich, supplying beds, bread, and souvenirs. Entire industries sprang up to cater to pilgrims, from sellers of wax candles to the artisans who stamped badges proving you'd visited a shrine. You slept better if you could flash one of those badges. It marked you as genuine, not just a wandering vagrant. but for the truly poor, even these economies were daunting. You might rely on church hostels or almonries that offered God's bed, usually straw in a communal room. Men and women separated, sometimes meals were included, often just bread and broth. It wasn't luxury, but at least it came with a sense of belonging. Historians still argue whether these hostels were more about charity or about managing the flow of humanity, keeping pilgrims contained and orderly so towns didn't drown under the weight of the devout. Quirky tidbit: in some places, pilgrims were given tokens entitling them to one night's free lodging. The catch? Only one. After that, the holy traveler had to move along, lest charity turn into freeloading. People found ways around it, trading tokens, faking identities, but the system shows just how carefully generosity was rationed. And then there were the improvised solutions. When beds were too expensive, pilgrims often just camped along the roadside, clustering in groups for warmth and safety. Imagine a huddle of cloaked figures sleeping under stars, staffs planted in the earth like flags of exhaustion. Fires flickered, prayers were mumbled, and thieves circled, hoping devotion had dulled vigilance. You lie there with them, clutching your bundle, half comforted by the murmured litanies around you. Sometimes wealthier pilgrims rented beds in monasteries or inns, leaving the poor to make do with the floors. And yes, there were arguments. Who got to claim the warm spot near the hearth? Who snored loudest? Joke number 2. Medieval pilgrimage might have saved your soul, but it definitely tested your patience. Historians still debate how much spiritual fervor versus sheer practicality drove these journeys. For many peasants, pilgrimage doubled as a chance to see the world, escape the manor, or even seek work along the road. Where you slept was just one part of the bargain. Some found themselves unexpectedly well-fed at hospices. Others ended up shivering under hedges, muttering that sainthood could wait until morning. Quirky tidbit number 2. Certain shrines had rules forbidding pilgrims from sleeping too close to relics. Apparently, people tried to snuggle up beside holy bones or saintly garments, hoping miracles might rub off while they snoozed. Officials had to step in, reminding everyone that the relics weren't medieval weighted blankets. As dawn breaks on your imagined pilgrimage, you rise with aching joints, brushing dirt or straw from your cloak. The road ahead is lined with others like you, trudging onward, heads bent, feet blistered. There is comfort in numbers, but there's also fatigue in the endless shuffle. You wonder if the shrine ahead will truly bless you, or if the real miracle is simply finding a warm bed that doesn't crawl with lice. Joke number 3. You'll probably get to heaven eventually, but only after sleeping in more questionable accommodations than a budget backpacker in modern Europe. The pilgrim crowd thins behind you, and the road stretches into farmland again, where fields roll out like patched quilts and smoke curls lazily from cottage chimneys. Here, another kind of traveler trudges along, seasonal workers, tinkers, smiths, shepherds driving flocks. They aren't on holy errands, and they aren't hunting relics. They're chasing wages, and when dusk arrives, they face the same question you do: where to rest a weary body without paying more than they earn. Itinerant workers lived on the move, tools slung across backs, sometimes pushing hand carts of wares. They weren't expecting luxury, they were expecting to improvise. You watch one man pull a cart off the road, tip it on its side, and crawl beneath it with a blanket. That's his bed. Another worker rigs 2 poles between trees, hangs a rough canvas, and lies suspended like a primitive hammock. Historians still argue whether such setups were common or just occasional ingenuity, but the records hint at poor folk constantly inventing ways to sleep without freezing. Mainstream fact: many of these workers followed seasonal cycles: reapers in summer, sheep shearers in spring, harvesters in autumn. Each job meant travel, and each journey meant nights spent in barns, fields, or under wagons. Landowners sometimes let them sleep in haylofts as part of wages, but more often it was an informal arrangement. Work by day, straw by night. You climb into such a loft once, the hay prickling your skin, the air thick with dust and the faint sweetness of grass. Not comfortable, but better than the ditch outside. Quirky tidbit: In some regions, workers actually built temporary shelters called booths, or bowers near the fields. Think of them as pop-up cabins made from branches, turf, or reeds. They looked scrappy, collapsed in storms, and leaked like sieves, but they gave just enough cover to pretend you had a home. Joke number 1. Congratulations, you've just invented the world's first rental tiny home minus the Instagram appeal. By night, these makeshift camps became lively hubs. Fires were lit, bread was shared, songs were sung. Workers traded gossip and gripes, sometimes even carved marks into trees or beams to say, "I slept here." It's a reminder that the road itself became a sort of shifting neighborhood, each night's street defined by where the wagons stopped. Historians still debate whether these bonds lasted beyond the season, but the evidence suggests friendships and rivalries carried from job to job. For those without even a wagon or tools, the body itself became the bed frame. Some tied cloaks between stakes, sleeping suspended like crude hammocks. Others dug shallow hollows in earth to block the wind, lining them with bracken. You try it once, scooping a dip in the soil, curling inside, cloak over your shoulders. It's not glamorous, but in the dead of night, the earth cradles you like a stubborn mattress. Joke number 2, sure, you could pay for a bed in a tavern, or you could just dig a personal grave-shaped hollow in the ground and call it budget travel. Sometimes landowners grudgingly offered barns or sheds for workers, especially if storms blew in. But it wasn't out of kindness, it was to keep the workforce alive enough to finish the harvest. You crawl into a cowshed one rainy night, pressed against warm bodies, the smell thick enough to make you gag. Still, warmth is warmth, even if it comes wrapped in flies. Quirky tidbit number 2. There are reports of reapers so exhausted they slept standing, leaning against scythes or cartwheels. It sounds absurd, but when your body collapses, you take whatever posture gravity allows. You try it once, leaning against a post, head nodding, until you jolt awake, convinced you've been robbed, only to realize the thief was just sleep itself. Historians still argue whether itinerant workers were envied for their freedom or pitied for their instability. From your perspective, it's a mix. The road offers variety, but every night demands invention. You never know if your bed will be straw, wagon plank, or a ditch, and you never know who will share it, a fellow worker, a farmer's dog, or a colony of bugs. Joke number 3. Forget bed and breakfast. Most nights you're lucky if you get ditch and dysentery. Morning comes and you stretch from your hollow hay sticking in your hair, clothes damp with dew. The wagons creak back onto the road. The fields shimmer with light, and you join the slow parade of moving labor. Another day's work, another night's improvised rest. The cycle grinds on, and you start to wonder whether the road itself has become your only real home. Your path now twists not into quiet farms or bustling fairs, but into the uneasy shadow of war. Conflict doesn't politely stay at borders. It spills into towns, villages, and roadsides. And when armies move, they drag behind them the same problem you've wrestled with every night: where to sleep. Only when soldiers needed beds, they didn't ask nicely. They were billeted, quartered, or simply shoved into civilian homes. If you're unlucky enough to be a poor peasant on the road, you might find yourself sleeping shoulder to shoulder with armed men, or worse, evicted from your own patch of straw to make room. Mainstream fact. Throughout medieval and early modern Europe, billeting was common practice. Lords or kings demanded local households host soldiers, sometimes feeding them too. For the wealthy, it was an expensive inconvenience. For the poor, it was often catastrophic. Imagine trudging into a village at dusk, hoping to beg a corner of a barn, only to find every corner already filled with men in armor, their boots steaming by the fire. You hesitate at the threshold of a cottage. The woman inside looks as tired as you, her small room crammed with rough-looking men gnawing bread. She shrugs helplessly. You won't be finding a bed here tonight. Soldiers eat first, sleep first, drink first. You, if you're allowed in at all, get the scraps. Joke number 1, medieval hospitality motto: Mi casa es su casa, unless my casa is already full of heavily armed strangers. Quirky tidbit. Some towns tried to regulate this chaos by creating official billet lists, assigning each household a quota of soldiers to host. In practice, that meant even the poorest families, who could barely feed themselves, suddenly had to share stew with strangers. You picture yourself curled in a corner while armored boots clomp across the floorboards inches from your head. Warmth, yes, but safety? Not so much. Historians still argue whether billeting was seen as a civic duty or simply state-sanctioned robbery. Records show endless complaints, beds broken, food devoured, even entire cottages trashed by their guests. Yet armies relied on this system. Moving thousands of men without infrastructure meant relying on ordinary people's homes, and by extension, it shaped how ordinary travelers like you found or lost lodgings. If you were clever, you might slip into the periphery of a military camp instead. Soldiers camped in fields outside towns, pitching tents or sleeping beneath wagons. At the edges of these camps, hangers-on gathered, merchants, prostitutes, beggars, and desperate peasants like you. You might huddle near their fires, hoping no one noticed you weren't part of the army. Joke number 2, the upside of sleeping near soldiers is that thieves usually stayed away. The downside is that the soldiers themselves might rob you first. The sensory details of these camps are unforgettable. Smoke, horse dung, metal clanging, drunken laughter, fires burned all night, and snores mingled with shouted orders. You try to sleep wrapped in your cloak, the ground hard and cold, every muscle tense. Will a boot kick you awake? Will a fight break out inches from your head? Sleep in such places was shallow, jittery, never secure. Sometimes billeting went further, forcing peasants out of their own homes altogether. Entire families slept in barns or outdoors while soldiers occupied their beds. For the wandering poor, that meant even fewer options. Villages already strained by hosting armies had no patience left for travelers. The road became harsher, lonelier as communities closed ranks, shutting their doors against anyone who wasn't a soldier. Quirky tidbit number 2. In some regions, households tried to get creative, building false walls or secret lofts to hide their better beds or food supplies from billeted soldiers. Imagine a tired peasant stumbling into such a place, not realizing their straw corner was hiding a feather mattress just on the other side of the wall. Morning in a billet village feels tense. You wake stiff from the ground, hearing soldiers stamping back into formation, their voices rising in chants. Civilians shuffle out, cleaning up messes left behind, muttering curses. You, meanwhile, slip quietly back onto the road, grateful to have survived the night without being conscripted, robbed, or trampled. Historians still debate whether billeting helped maintain order by spreading soldiers among civilians, or whether it destroyed trust between armies and the people. From your perspective, it hardly matters. For the poor traveler, it meant another night dictated not by choice but by power. Sometimes the bed was stolen outright, sometimes shared unwillingly, and sometimes denied altogether. Joke number 3. You've been downgraded from unwelcome guest to furniture. Just part of the scenery, shoved against a wall so the soldiers can stretch out. At least walls don't complain. As the sun lifts, you leave behind the echoes of boots and orders, carrying with you the realization that the politics of kings have a way of invading even your most private moments of rest. War fades behind you, but the road delivers you toward the crush of a city. Unlike the village with its single tavern, or the manor with its barn, the town bursts with choices and with rules. For the poor traveler, lodging here is both easier and harder. Easier because there are more shelters, harder because officials actually care where you put your head at night. You shuffle through the gate just as dusk paints the rooftops. Merchants pack up stalls, apprentices sweep thresholds, and watchmen light torches. The smell is a cocktail of fish, dung, and fresh bread. If you were wealthy, you'd pay for a bed in one of the better inns, but you're not. You're one of the wandering poor, and the city notices you immediately. Mainstream fact, many medieval towns had official hostels, often run by guilds, municipalities, or the church to handle the tide of pilgrims, workers, and beggars. These weren't luxurious. They were rows of straw mats, sometimes with a communal pot of stew. Some charged a small fee. Others required proof you were on a legitimate journey. Pilgrim badges worked wonders. Tattered clothes with no explanation did not. Historians still argue whether such hostels were truly charitable or more about control, keeping vagrants off the streets and under watch, because cities had laws, and one of the harshest targeted vagrancy. Sleep in the wrong doorway, and you risked a fine, a whipping, or simply being kicked awake by a night watchman. Joke number 1. Checkout time in medieval cities was whenever the guards decided they were sick of you. Quirky tidbit, some cities even had curfews that included rules against sleeping outdoors. The bells would ring, gates would shut, and everyone was supposed to be indoors, or at least out of sight. If you hadn't secured shelter by then, you were in trouble. You can almost hear the bell tolling as you scramble for a space, hoping some hostel or alehouse still has room. Alehouses offered another option. They weren't proper inns, but for a few coins you might get space on a bench, or even just the right to lie on the floor after closing. Loud, smoky, and sticky with spilled ale? Yes, but also filled with laughter, dice games, and the occasional snore before the mugs were cleared. For a poor traveler, those benches were golden. You imagine curling up beneath a trestle table, the wood sticky against your cheek, trying to ignore the arguments overhead. But for those with nothing at all, the city streets became a grim alternative. Bridges were popular spots, arches offered shelter from rain, the rats offered companionship. Doorways too, though you had to be quick before the constable spotted you. Joke number 2. If you ever wanted the excitement of being a criminal without committing an actual crime, just try sleeping near the cathedral steps. Instant outlaw. Municipal authorities sometimes established poor houses or night shelters specifically to corral the destitute. They weren't pleasant. Picture a dim room, packed wall to wall with bodies, the air thick with sweat and coughs. Still, compared to being beaten for trespassing, it was preferable. At least there you were tolerated, even if lice were your inevitable bedfellows. Quirky tidbit number 2. In some towns, guilds of certain trades offered beds for traveling workers of their craft. If you were a shoemaker, for instance, another shoemaker might host you. But if you were a nameless peasant laborer, too bad. No guild card, no bed. You sigh, realizing that in the medieval city, even sleep required professional networking. Historians still debate whether towns were safer or more dangerous for the poor. On one hand, more people meant more charity, more chance of finding food. On the other, more rules meant more ways to get punished. You fall asleep at last in a charity hostel, press shoulder to shoulder with strangers, and wonder whether freedom on the road was easier than the surveillance of city walls. Joke number 3. Sure, you survived the night without frostbite, but you also woke up with someone else's foot in your face. Comfort is relative. As dawn seeps through narrow windows, bells clang, and the city wakes to markets and church bells, you stretch stiffly, gather your bundle, and slip back into the crowd. The city gives, but it also takes, and for a poor traveler, the bed you find each night is just another reflection of its mood. Leaving the city gates behind, you realize something you've been ignoring this whole journey. It isn't just where you sleep, but what you sleep on. A patch of straw might sound harmless, even soft, but the reality is far less dreamy. Bedding in the medieval world was rarely clean, often damp, and frequently alive. Alive with the small, biting creatures that loved human company as much as humans hated theirs. Mainstream fact, bedbugs and lice were practically universal. Nobles had them, peasants had them, monasteries had them. No amount of status kept them out for long. Mattresses were sacks stuffed with straw, reeds, or chaff, and unless they were replaced or aired out frequently, they turned into perfect bug habitats. Imagine lying down after a day's march, pulling your cloak tight and feeling that telltale tickle of tiny legs. Joke number 1, welcome to your all-inclusive inn where the bugs eat free and the guests never sleep well. The smell was another challenge. Straw that had been used too long turned musty, sometimes sour, and always dusty. You cough as particles rise into your nose, scratching at your throat. In barns or stables, the straw was often shared with animals first. By the time it reached you, it carried the warm perfume of manure. Still better than bare stone, or so you tell yourself as you nestle into a corner. Historians still argue whether peasants cared much about hygiene compared to elites. Some claim rural folk changed bedding rarely. Others suggest they were more pragmatic, swapping out straw as soon as it rotted. Either way, for a poor traveler, you rarely had the luxury of choice. Whatever pile was offered, you took. Quirky tidbit: some travelers carried their own bedrolls, but don't picture a sleek sleeping bag. These were bundles of spare cloth, sometimes stuffed with grass or moss tied with rope. Portable, yes, but lumpy and often wet by morning. Still, they kept you off the bare ground and gave the illusion of home. Pests weren't just a nuisance, they carried disease. Fleas especially thrived in bedding, and while you can't see them tonight, you know they're there, bouncing through the straw. You scratch at your arm, already imagining red welts. Joke number 2. Congratulations, you've invented the medieval alarm clock. It's just an itch that wakes you every hour. Some monasteries or hostels tried to fight the infestation with herbs. Beds might be sprinkled with lavender, mint, or wormwood. The sharp scents helped mask the smell and were believed to drive out pests. You lower your head into such a fragrant pile once, inhaling the earthy sweetness, pretending for a moment that you've stumbled into luxury. Historians still debate whether the herbs worked on bugs, but at least they worked on human nerves. Blankets, too, tell their story. Wool was common, heavy and warm, though not immune to moths. Poor travelers often had just a cloak doubled as blanket and pillow. You pull yours tight around you, the edges frayed, trying to imagine you're wrapped in something finer. In winter, travelers huddled together for warmth, strangers becoming unwilling bedmates just to keep fingers from freezing. Quirky tidbit number 2. There are records of people heating stones and fires, wrapping them in cloth, and tucking them under bedding to fight the cold. You imagine clutching such a stone on a bitter night, a medieval hot water bottle, praying you don't roll onto it and bruise your ribs. But even the act of lying down was ritual. Some crossed themselves, muttered prayers, or recited charms against pests and nightmares. Others shook out straw as best they could, hoping to trick themselves into believing it was fresh. Historians still argue whether people accepted bugs as inevitable or genuinely fought them night after night. From your perspective, exhaustion usually won. You just closed your eyes and let the creatures feast. Joke number 3. At least bedbugs don't complain about your snoring. Small mercies. So you drift off, itchy, dusty, and wrapped in a cloak that smells faintly of smoke. Comfort is relative and hygiene is a luxury you can't afford. Still, with the moon rising and your body surrendering, even a flea-ridden pile of straw feels like paradise compared to the endless road. The itch of straw and fleas lingers, but sleep is never just about comfort. It's also about what swirls in your mind as you lie down. Out here on the road, under rafters or hedges or barn beams, you don't just fight bugs and cold. You wrestle with shadows, whispers, and the half-believed stories that seep into your bones. Because in the medieval world, where darkness was deeper than ours and explanations were thinner, the night was never just night. Mainstream fact: superstition shaped daily life, and bedtime rituals were common across all classes. You cross yourself before lying down, murmur the paternoster, or tuck a little charm under your pillow. Many people believed that sleep left the soul vulnerable, wandering away from the body. To guard against demons or nightmares, prayers weren't optional, they were armor. Historians still argue whether this was theology or folk tradition creeping into Christian life, but the effect was the same. You never closed your eyes without some ritual. Quirky tidbit: some travelers carried amulets against bad dreams. One popular charm was a tiny bag of salt tied to clothing, believed to ward off evil spirits. Others tucked knives under pillows, not only for protection against thieves, but also against witches who might creep into dreams. Imagine lying in straw, clutching a rusty blade, whispering a prayer, half soldier, half child, afraid of the dark. Sounds, too, became fuel for fear. The creak of a barn beam, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of mice in straw. Each could be interpreted as something sinister. You lie awake hearing footsteps that might just be your own heartbeat echoing in your ears. Joke number 1. Congratulations, you've turned rodent noises into a full-scale haunting. Folk stories filled these nights. A traveling companion might tell you not to whistle after dark, lest spirits hear. Another swears that sleeping too close to crossroads invites ghosts, because souls of the unburied linger where paths meet. You remember this as you stretch out beneath a tree near just such a crossing. Sleep comes slowly, every rustle magnified. Superstitions weren't always fearful, they could be oddly comforting. Some peasants believed sleeping with shoes pointing outward kept journeys safe, or that turning your cloak inside out confused fairies, who might try to carry you off. You try it once, cloak flipped, half amused, half desperate. Historians still debate whether these beliefs were widespread or regional quirks, but they stitched the night with meaning. Quirky tidbit number 2. In some places, people told tales of the nightmare, a spirit that pressed on your chest while you slept, causing terrifying dreams. The cure? Place an iron key beneath your pillow or recite a rhyme before bed. You mutter one under your breath, though the only real weight on your chest tonight is the exhaustion dragging you down. Joke number 2. It's not exactly restful when you're worried both about fleas and fairies abducting you mid-dream. Sleep insurance in the medieval world really should have come with better coverage. Fires and candles also played their role. A guttering flame was believed to invite wandering souls. So many travelers snuffed it carefully before closing their eyes. Others left a small ember glowing, both for light and as a signal to ward off thieves, or so they hoped. You watch smoke twist upward, wondering whether it carries prayers or warnings. Storytelling itself became a kind of ritual. Groups of travelers often shared legends before sleeping, saints who protected wanderers, demons punished for trickery, or animals that guided lost souls. The words wrapped around you like another blanket, part shield, part entertainment. Maybe you laugh nervously at a tale of a ghostly monk, or nod along to one about a saint who turned away wolves. Either way, it shapes your dreams. Joke number 3. The medieval bedtime story wasn't "Good night, moon." It was more like, "Good night, terrifying phantom who may or may not sit on my chest tonight. Sweet dreams." Eventually, your body wins the battle with fear. The prayers, charms, and whispered stories fade into the rhythm of your breathing. You curl deeper into your cloak, bugs scratching, shadows watching, and drift into uneasy rest. In the morning, the sun will banish both spirits and doubts, and you'll laugh at yourself for being so jumpy. But tonight, as you slip into dreams, the line between folklore and reality feels thin as a cobweb stretched across your face. Dawn finds you moving again, heavier with stories than with food. Each night has been its own trial. Barns that smelled of hay and dung, hedges that scratched your face, alehouse benches sticky with spilled drink, monasteries where prayers hummed louder than snores. But what ties it all together isn't just the discomfort, it's the way poor travelers adapted endlessly, shaping their own little pockets of rest out of whatever scraps the world offered. Mainstream fact: throughout the Middle Ages, travel was dangerous, slow, and rarely comfortable, yet people did it constantly, whether for trade, pilgrimage, or necessity. The poor, more than anyone, relied on resourcefulness. A sack became a pillow, a cloak, a blanket, a group of strangers, a wall against wolves or thieves. You too have stitched together these makeshift habits, and they've kept you alive. Historians still argue whether medieval life was defined more by hardship or resilience. Were peasants crushed by endless struggle, or were they masters of improvisation, making do with far less than modern comfort demands? You can see both sides. The hunger, the itching straw, the fear of the night, but also the laughter at roadside fires, the prayers whispered in unison, the human warmth in barns packed with travelers. Quirky tidbit, some poor wanderers left marks behind, scratching symbols on doors or trees to signal whether a household was kind, stingy, or hostile. Early hobo signs, medieval style. You imagine spotting one carved into a post and sighing with relief. You're not the first to need guidance, and you won't be the last. Joke number 1. Yelp reviews didn't exist, but apparently carving "Don't sleep here" on a doorframe worked just as well. As you near the end of this wandering, the truth becomes clear. Sleeping arrangements for poor medieval travelers weren't about luxury. They were about survival and creativity. Each night brought uncertainty, but also proof of human stubbornness. You can picture yourself one last time, curling under your cloak, praying bugs stay away, laughing at your own misfortune, and somehow, despite it all, drifting into sleep. Joke number 2. Your biggest achievement isn't reaching your destination. It's surviving 15 nights without becoming a midnight snack for fleas. And finally, joke number 3. If you've learned anything, it's that medieval travel was basically a never-ending sleepover where nobody invited you, and everyone forgot to wash the sheets. Now as your journey winds down, let the narrative itself soften. The rough straw fades, the cold hedges dissolve, and even the itchy pests grow quiet. What lingers is the rhythm of walking, resting, waking, and walking again. The simple cycle that carried millions of anonymous souls across landscapes, centuries, and hardships. You let your body grow heavy, as if you finally laid down your bundle for good. The sounds of the road dim, replaced by a hush, like a blanket being drawn over the world. The imagined fire crackles softer, shadows stretch longer, and your mind begins to blur the line between history and dream. There's comfort here, hidden in the very ordinariness of it all. For every poor traveler who once shivered on straw or pressed against a cold wall, there's a trace of endurance, a quiet victory of sleep snatched against the odds. And you, listening now, share in that timeless resilience. You know the roads were long, the beds were rough, the nights were uneasy, but still, morning always came, so breathe slower. Picture yourself on a quiet hillside, far from watchmen and fleas, with nothing but grass beneath you and the steady stars above. The worries shrink to whispers, the discomfort fades to background, and all that remains is the slow drift of rest. Let go of the road, the barns, the hedges. Let go of the noise of the world. You've walked far enough, you've learned enough, and now the only thing left is peace. Good night, traveler. Sleep well, dream deeply, and remember, the story always continues tomorrow.